It was early evening in Oxford when I found myself wandering through the quadrangle of St. Luke's, a college I had little reason to visit, but which, for that very reason, held a peculiar attraction. The flagstones were damp from an afternoon drizzle, and the faint scent of wet earth mixed with the sharper tang of fresh varnish on the oak doors. A chorus of pigeons muttered in the cloisters, nothing remarkable. And yet, as always, Oxford lent even the ordinary an air of secret significance. I paused beneath a lantern that had just begun to glow, its weak circle of light catching a student's discarded scarf at the edge of the lawn. No one was near, but I thought of the hand that had dropped it, of the small decision that had caused its absence from a shoulder or throat. Such trivia has always interested me more than it should, for in the pattern of the trivial lies the greater design. One might call it the crossword principle. The tiniest letter in the wrong square unravels the entire solution. From an upstairs window came the sound of a piano, hesitant at first, then breaking into a more confident run of scales. I knew the piece, but could not name it. I stood listening for a minute, perhaps longer, and thought about how music carried more truth than words. It had always seemed to me that Oxford was at its most authentic when filtered through notes drifting into the damp air. Lewis appeared at last, emerging from the archway with the deliberate tread of a man who had been counting his steps. He told me that a porter had called in, muttering something troubling. Not urgent, not yet, but enough to merit our presence. I asked what form the trouble took, though even as I asked, I found myself reluctant to know. He shrugged, and I recognized that shrug. It was his way of saying that he preferred not to trouble me with details until details were unavoidable. We walked together toward the porter's lodge. The old fellow inside had the red-veined eyes of someone who alternated between gin and gossip. He spoke in the clipped manner of those who like to believe themselves keepers of the college soul. There had been, he said, a discovery in the north wing, nothing violent, but unusual all the same. A set of papers left scattered on a staircase, unsigned, though plainly of importance. He was vague about their contents, as though the words themselves carried a danger. I listened, nodded, and asked the kind of questions that could pass for politeness. Who found them? How long they had lain there? Whether anyone had been seen ascending or descending. His answers were either uncertain or unhelpful. Yet something in his tone and overly careful phrasing, an unnecessary cough before speaking, convinced me he knew more than he cared to confess. People seldom reveal the truth directly. It slips sideways in the pauses and hesitations. I filed it away. When we left, Lewis asked me what I made of it. I told him that papers are not like scarves or umbrellas. One may misplace a scarf without consequence, but papers are abandoned with intent. He looked at me in the way he often did, torn between doubt and trust. I left the matter there. Too many words at such an hour serve no purpose. As we crossed the quadrangle once more, the light had thickened into a gentle dusk. A bell struck the hour, and the notes echoed against the stone, dispersing into the corners where shadows began to gather. I thought about how often an investigation begins not with a body, but with something half seen, half heard, half believed, an object out of place, a tone slightly awry. The rest is only the slow unfolding of inevitability. We stood for a moment in silence. The scarf still lay where I had first noticed it, but now, darker, its colours subdued by the failing light. I felt, with a curious certainty, that it too belonged to the puzzle that had begun to reveal itself. I could not yet see the picture. But the first letter had been placed in the grid, and the word would come, however reluctantly, in time. It was Lewis who told me, with a kind of reluctant finality, that Dr. Halliwell had been found dead. He used the word discovered as though death were an artifact one stumbled across in the grass, and I remember thinking it suited the situation better than he realized. A man does not simply die, he is uncovered, laid bare, removed from the invisible architecture of life and placed under scrutiny. Halliwell had been, for all his eccentricities, part of that hidden scaffolding. The body lay in one of the upper rooms of the north wing, not 50 yards from the staircase where those papers had been seen the previous evening. It was Lewis who pointed out the proximity, though he did so with the careful tone of one unwilling to push his luck with me too early in a case. The room was a don's office, sparsely decorated, its bookshelves sagging with the weight of volumes no one had touched in decades. The curtains had not been drawn, and the weak September light angled across his desk, illuminating a circle of dust that had once framed a lamp. The lamp itself was missing. I noticed that, though Lewis did not. Halliwell was seated in his chair, his head bent awkwardly against his shoulder, as if he had dozed off in the middle of a thought he never completed. His hand still rested on the armrest, the fingers half curled inwards. There was a peculiar stillness about him, a sense not of violence, but of cessation. A glass of water stood by his right hand, and beside it a sheet of lined paper, half filled with a kind of hurried scrawl. The words themselves offered nothing immediately useful, though one phrase, an obscure Latin quotation from Seneca, seemed to me too deliberate to be chanced. I said nothing to Lewis, better to keep the small deductions private until they grow into something worth sharing. The college physician, a brisk man with a thin moustache, was already present. He confirmed the obvious, that Halliwell had been dead for by some hours, perhaps since the night before. He offered heart failure, exhaustion, stress, but all too easily. Death does not generally arrive in such tidy packages, and I distrusted the readiness of his conclusion. I caught him glancing now and then at the papers on the desk, as though wondering whether to pocket them. That glance told me more than his words. I left Lewis to speak with the physician and wandered about the room. The books drew me, as they always do. I read spines more carefully than most men read letters, and it did not escape me that a volume of Chaucer was oddly out of alignment, pushed back deeper into the shelf than its neighbours. I ran a finger along the row. Dust clung to every spine but that one. It had been touched recently. I filed that detail away with the missing lamp. Lewis joined me at the window. He asked what I thought, and I answered, perhaps too curtly, that I thought little at all. He smiled faintly, knowing that my dismissal was a form of interest. He gestured towards the paper on the desk and wondered aloud whether it might be a suicide note. I told him it was no such thing. A suicide note does not quote Seneca half finished, it concludes. He looked puzzled, but said no more. As we prepared to leave, the college chaplain entered, his robe slightly askew, his breathing laboured as if he had come quickly. He looked at Halliwell for a long while and said, not to us, but to the room itself, that it was an end no one could have expected. His eyes lingered on the desk, then drifted toward the shadowed corner where the lamp should have been. He knew, I thought, what had been there. Yet he did not speak of it, and I did not ask. Outside, the quadrangle had grown heavier with the smell of damp stone. Rain had returned, faint at first, then stronger, tapping against the panes of the lodge. I thought again of that scarf on the grass. A small clue, a letter in a crossword. Halliwell's death had drawn a dark line through the grid, and the answer would demand itself sooner or later. But as I stood there, watching the droplets gather and fall, I could not help feeling that Oxford itself was withholding the rest of the word, guarding its secrets with the patience of centuries. The college had a way of darkening at dusk that felt older than its stone. I returned the following evening, when the quadrangle was half claimed by shadow, the lanterns flickering into life one by one, as though reluctant to admit the absence of day. Students passed in small groups, their laughter oddly hushed, their figures breaking apart at the corners of the lawn, like fragments of a dream dispersing on waking. Something had altered in the air since Halliwell's death, an undercurrent of watchfulness, as if every corridor now contained a witness not quite willing to speak. The master of St. Luke's had arranged a gathering in the senior common room, ostensibly to offer words of condolence, though more likely to manage appearances. I have long believed that Oxford values appearances more than it does truth. The room itself smelled of stale tobacco and aged Madeira, with portraits of long-forgotten fellows peering down in indifferent sympathy. The fire had been lit too early, and the room's heat pressed against the back of my neck as I stood at the threshold, watching the assembled company. There was the chaplain, his robe more neatly arranged tonight, though his eyes betrayed the restless guilt of a man who has prayed without conviction. The physician was present too, speaking too loudly about minor ailments, as though to remind us all of his authority in the realm of bodies. A handful of tutors, faces lined with premature weariness, nodded gravely to one another, their gestures precise, their expressions guarded. Shadows gathered not only in the corners of the room, but in the space between their words. Lewis shifted uncomfortably beside me. He has never liked these gatherings, too much wine, too little honesty. I watched him accept a glass all the same, out of courtesy, and then place it untouched on a side table. He asked whether I thought the meeting would reveal anything. I told him it already was. He frowned at that, but I offered no elaboration. Better to keep the deductions folded like paper in my pocket until they are ready to be unfolded. The master spoke, briefly and with the formality of a man who would rather be doing anything else. He described Halliwell as a devoted scholar, a loyal servant of the college, and a man of quiet integrity. The words were measured, correct, and utterly lifeless. No one contradicted them, yet no one seemed comforted. I observed how the chaplain's eyes slid toward the fire with a sudden intensity when integrity was mentioned. That glance was worth more than the master's entire speech. Afterward, the gathering broke into small knots of conversation. I drifted from group to group, listening without seeming to listen. A younger Don remarked, a little too quickly, that Halliwell had never been well liked, though he meant it kindly, as if disliking a man were a form of respect. Another whispered of debts, gambling perhaps, or worse, but hushed himself the moment he noticed my proximity. And then there was the librarian, a thin woman with iron-grey hair, who stood apart, sipping her sherry in silence. It was she who caught my attention, not for what she said, but for what she did not. Her eyes moved constantly to the door, as though she expected someone yet to arrive. Lewis asked me later what I had noticed. I told him that people reveal themselves most clearly when they are forced to speak kindly of the dead. Lies, like ill-fitting coats, are easily spotted. He asked whom I suspected of lying. I answered with some reluctance that nearly all of them had. Before we left, I found myself drawn to the portraits above the mantelpiece. Dust filmed the canvases, but one frame was conspicuously clean, as though someone had recently touched it. A trivial detail, yet it held me for a moment. I thought of the Chaucer volume out of alignment, the missing lamp, the scarf left behind, each a small square in a crossword grid whose solution remained maddeningly incomplete. We stepped back into the quadrangle. The rain had begun again, gentler this time, soft enough to make the flagstones glisten. The college windows glowed faintly behind us, each rectangle of light a reminder that life continued in spite of death. Yet the silence between the drops carried a weight of its own, as though the very stones were whispering their secrets into the night, too low for human ears to catch. I walked away with the certainty that Halliwell's death was not an end, but a beginning, though of what I could not yet say. The letter came to me not directly, but through Lewis, who carried it into the station with the awkward solemnity of a man transporting something far more delicate than paper. He said it had been found in Halliwell's desk drawer, folded neatly inside a book of sermons. The porter had handed it over without comment, though his expression had suggested he knew the weight of what he was giving away. I asked Lewis whether he had read it. He shook his head. He said it did not feel right to pry before I did. I thought that was oddly touching. I waited until the office had thinned of sound before I unfolded the letter. The handwriting was Halliwell's untidy, hurried, the lines drifting like a tired scholar, unable to confine himself to margins. It was addressed to no one, and yet it was plainly meant for someone. The words themselves spoke not of confession, but of irritation. A grievance repeated, a demand unmet, a disappointment disguised as philosophy. The Latin quotations were there again, stitched in between the sentences like small disguises. I translated them as I went, though they did not add much beyond a kind of theatrical dignity. And yet one phrase caught me. Repetita juvunt. Repeated things help. It struck me as deliberate, as if the letter itself had been meant to be read more than once. Lewis stood by the window while I read, shifting occasionally as if waiting for a verdict. He asked me, when I finally placed the paper down, what I made of it. I told him only that I intended to read it again. He laughed softly at that, but I meant it. A letter is seldom what it seems at first encounter. Its meaning ripens, sours, or alters with repetition. So I read it once more, slower this time. And there it was, the absence, the slip. Halliwell mentioned a meeting arranged for the following Thursday, yet he had died on a Wednesday evening. The Thursday in question had not yet arrived. The appointment remained unfulfilled. It was a small deduction, but it flickered in my mind with unwelcome persistence. Whoever he had intended to see was still at large, still waiting perhaps, or perhaps already aware that the meeting would never come. I folded the letter again and asked Lewis what he noticed. He shrugged, said that it seemed like the ramblings of a bitter man. Perhaps it was. Yet bitterness alone does not explain a missing lamp, or a book displaced on a shelf, or a scarf abandoned on wet stone. I told him so, though not unkindly. He frowned, as he always does when confronted with puzzles that refuse immediate sense. I envied him for his honesty. Later that evening I took the letter to my flat and placed it on the table beside a glass of whiskey. The rain had begun again outside, steady against the panes, and I let the rhythm of it guide me through the words once more. The phrase "repeated things help" lingered in my thoughts, as if Halliwell himself had left behind an instruction. I read the letter aloud, this time, hearing how the cadence shifted when certain names or phrases appeared. A pause after integrity, a stumble before trust. Words are seldom innocent in their arrangement. I cannot say I understood the letter fully that night. What I knew was that it had been written for someone specific, and that person had not yet stepped forward. Whether they were hiding or merely biding their time, I could not tell. But the letter was not a farewell, nor was it a confession. It was a message in transit, interrupted, and there is nothing more dangerous than a message that fails to reach its destination. When I finally placed the paper back in its envelope, I felt a strange reluctance, as if I were concealing a clue from myself. I poured another measure and sat by the window, watching the lights of Oxford blur against the rain. Somewhere in those blurred lines was the figure Halliwell had meant to meet. And if repeated things help, then perhaps reading the night itself twice might yield its answer. There are evenings when Oxford seems composed entirely of sound. Not the crude clamour of traffic, nor the chatter of tourists, but something finer. Half-hidden organ pipes drifting from chapel windows, the hush of rain on cloister roofs, the hesitant practice of a student's violin in an attic room. That night, as I walked back through St. Luke's quadrangle, I heard music again. A piano, the same window as before, a simple melody but played in minor, its contours altered, its heart bruised. The notes fell like questions unanswered. Lewis, trailing beside me, remarked that it was late for music. He said it with the mild suspicion of a man who believes that past a certain hour, all good things turn improper. I asked him whether he recognized the piece. He shook his head. I told him it was Schubert, though I wasn't entirely sure. One grows less certain over time, and the boundaries between memory and recognition blur. He asked what it meant, and I said it meant nothing. But I listened more closely all the same. The pianist faltered at one point, an error quickly corrected, but the pause told me something. Music, like handwriting, carries traces of its owner. The hesitation, the way the left hand dragged fractionally behind the right, the weight on certain chords, these were clues, though not yet assembled into coherence. I stored them away as one might store a half-solved clue in the crossword, unfinished but awaiting a later letter to confirm. We were on our way to the library. Halliwell had spent most of his later years there, according to the porter, preferring its draughts and dim light to the comforts of his rooms. The library was nearly empty when we entered, the scent of parchment and polish mingling with the faint damp that had seeped in through the stone. The librarian, the same woman I had noticed at the gathering, stood at her desk with an expression too composed to be genuine. She acknowledged us with the politeness of one determined to conceal impatience. Lewis asked her about Halliwell's habits. She replied in short, efficient sentences, as if answering examination questions. He came most afternoons. He requested the same desk near the eastern window. He returned books irregularly, often late. She offered these details with the air of someone describing a man already consigned to the past. Yet, as she spoke, I noticed her hand resting on the counter, tapping in rhythm with the music, still faintly audible outside. Not consciously, not dramatically, just enough to betray familiarity. She knew the pianist, perhaps she was the pianist. The minor key had travelled with her fingers. I asked her, without asking, whether she liked Schubert. She blinked, paused, and said that she preferred silence. But her tapping ceased the moment I named him. A small deduction, but it flickered. She was guarding something, though whether it belonged to herself, to Halliwell, or to the college, I could not yet say. We left the library with little gained, at least in Lewis's view. He muttered that we were chasing shadows. I reminded him that shadows are not meaningless, they are proof of light. He gave me that half-smile of his, unsure whether I was serious or merely indulging myself. I let him wonder. Back in my room later, I poured a measure of whiskey and set the letter from Halliwell on the table once more. I read it again, as he had perhaps meant me to. Repetita juvant. The phrase settled differently now, with the music still echoing in my ears. Repetition, hesitation, the minor key. I thought of the missing lamp, the book displaced, the tapping hand of the librarian. None of it amounted to proof, but a crossword is seldom solved in a single sitting. One must leave it, return, look again at what had once seemed impenetrable, and find that a clue has shifted under the weight of time. The rain had thickened outside, and through it the music faltered once more, then ceased altogether. Silence felt like an unfinished bar, a phrase abandoned mid-cadence. I sat quietly, with the whiskey, with the letter. Oxford held its breath around me. Somewhere in the silence an answer had been played, though not yet heard. It was Lewis who suggested we walk through the gardens. He said it would clear the mind, though he knew as well as I did that gardens seldom offer clarity. They are curated illusions, harsh paths meant to guide, flowers meant to distract. St. Luke's possessed a glass house at the far end, a Victorian structure of iron ribs and misted panes, its warmth at odds with the damp chill outside. I agreed, more out of curiosity than hope. The porter unlocked it for us, muttering something about condensation damaging the hinges. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of earth and overripe orchids. Drops of water slid down the panes like hesitant signatures. The silence was not complete, the faint hum of a heater, the occasional drip from leaf to soil, the whisper of our shoes on the tiled floor. Oxford's noise seemed impossibly far away. Halliwell had been seen here often, according to the porter. He would bring a notebook, sit at a small wrought-iron table, and write until dusk. The librarian too had visited, though less regularly. Lewis said it sounded like a rendezvous. I told him that not all meetings were assignations. He grinned and said he preferred plain words. I said nothing further. I walked among the plants, touching nothing, only watching. A gardener's tools lay abandoned in one corner, a pair of shears, a coil of twine, a trowel with soil still clinging to its blade. Ordinary enough, but the twine caught my eye. A length had been cut and discarded, knotted once, then frayed at the end. Not the knot of a gardener, but something tighter, deliberate. I picked it up, studied it, and returned it carefully to its place. Lewis asked what I had seen. I told him it was just a knot, but in truth I felt the first stirrings of unease. A knot is a symbol of binding, of secrecy, of things meant to hold. Perhaps Halliwell had understood that better than we did. On the table where he had once written lay a single page warped by the humidity. I bent to read nothing more than an incomplete sentence. In repetition lies the measure of truth. The words trailed off into nothing. Lewis asked if it was Halliwell's hand. I believed so, though the ink had blurred. He wondered aloud whether it was meant for the same correspondent as the letter. I told him perhaps, but not yet. He said he disliked riddles. I said that riddles disliked him more. The glass-house windows trembled faintly in the wind, shadows shifting across the floor. I noticed how the plants leaned, subtly, towards one corner. Not towards the sun, but towards the heater. In that corner, a pane of glass bore a small fracture, spiderwebbing outward. A careless accident, perhaps, yet the fracture was on the inner surface. I touched it with my fingertip and thought of how easily a surface betrays force applied from within. Pressure leaves its mark, whether in glass or in people. Lewis grew restless and asked whether I expected to find answers among orchids. I told him answers are seldom where we expect them, and that orchids have been known to thrive on neglect. He shook his head, muttering that I had drunk too much poetry. Perhaps he was right. When we left, the evening had already dimmed into a damp grey. The porter locked the glass house behind us with a metallic click, as though sealing away something we had no business knowing. I looked back once. Through the fogged panes, the plants seemed to blur into one another, vines and shadows entangled, their outlines indistinguishable. A gathering of secrets, patient and rooted, awaiting the next visitor. Later, alone with a crossword in my flat, I thought again of the knot, the unfinished sentence, the fractured glass. clues too small to command belief, yet too insistent to dismiss. I penciled in a tentative answer to one of the clues binding. It fit imperfectly, yet it lingered, as if the grid itself were reminding me that the enigma was not confined to orchids or iron frames. It had wound itself tighter around us than we cared to admit. It was Lewis who placed the envelope on my desk, his fingers resting on it as if reluctant to release it. He said it had come from the college solicitors, a sealed bundle marked with Halliwell's name and the dry authority of legal stationery. I nodded, though something in me resisted. A man's will is less about wealth than about what he chooses to reveal and what he chooses to conceal. Both, in their way, are dangerous. I opened it with the care of someone turning the last page of a book he has not enjoyed but feels compelled to finish. The clauses were written in the formal stiffness of legal Latin, translated badly into English. Halliwell had left very little, a modest sum to the college library, a small endowment for music scholarships, and the remainder to someone whose name I had not expected. The librarian. Her name, written in full, underlined by finality. Lewis exhaled softly when he read over my shoulder. He asked whether I had suspected it. I told him I suspected everyone, but not always for the right reasons. Alongside the will lay a photograph. Black and white, slightly creased, the edges curling. It showed Halliwell much younger, seated at the same desk in the library, his gaze not on the camera, but on the figure beside him. A woman. Not the librarian, at least, not as she appears now. The face was blurred slightly, the smile uncertain, the eyes turned away at the moment of capture. Yet there was something unmistakable in the tilt of the head, the line of the jaw. Lewis said he couldn't be sure. I told him I could. Time alters faces, but not their architecture. We sat in silence for a moment. The rain was steady outside, tapping the glass with a persistence that felt accusatory. I turned the photograph over. On the back, in Halliwell's untidy hand, was written only a single date. No name, no place. Just the year, faint but legible. It was the same year he had published his last article, the one filled with obscure references that no one had bothered to decipher. The photograph belonged to the same pattern of omission, an absence masquerading as record. Lewis asked me what it meant. I said it meant that wills are seldom about money, and photographs seldom about likeness. He frowned, unused to riddles when he wanted facts. I told him that facts are nothing without the shadows around them. He muttered that shadows don't stand up in court. I replied that neither often do facts. I noticed something that had escaped me at first glance. The desk in the photograph, Halliwell's desk, bore the same crooked lamp, tilted slightly to the right. The very lamp is missing now. The absence and the image formed a strange symmetry. An object captured, an object gone. I said nothing to Lewis, but inside the thought turned restlessly, like a word that refuses to fit the crossword, but will not leave the page. Later, I walked alone through the corridors of St. Luke's, the photograph folded carefully in my pocket. The college seemed emptier than usual, its staircases echoing with the faint complaints of old wood. In the library, the east window glowed with lamplight, and I imagined Halliwell seated there still, the blurred figure beside him, both of them preserved in silence, as if Oxford itself had chosen to guard their secret. I asked the librarian quietly whether she remembered the year written on the photograph. She looked at me, unblinking, and said she remembered every year, but some she preferred not to speak of. Her hand rested again on the counter, steady now, no tapping. She said that Halliwell had been a complicated man, and that memories were not always gifts. Then she turned away, ending the conversation without ending it. That night, back in my flat, I placed the will and the photograph side by side. 2 documents, each claiming to tell the truth, each concealing more than they revealed. I thought again of Halliwell's unfinished sentence, of the knot in the glasshouse, of the music in minor keys. Nothing yet formed a pattern, but the grid was tightening, letters bleeding into one another. I poured a whiskey, let the photograph rest under the lamplight, and wondered if repetition would help me as it had once helped him. The rain whispered on, patient, unanswering. It was in the senior common room again, though the gathering this time was smaller, more furtive. The excuse was an informal supper, wine provided by the college cellars, bread and cheese in modest abundance. Yet everyone there knew that food was incidental. Words were the true currency of the evening, and words, once uncorked like wine, can never be poured back into silence. Lewis sat a little apart from me, nursing a glass he had no intention of finishing. He dislikes wine, though he will never admit it openly. I sipped mine with greater seriousness. Claret. A little too young, but it carried with it the right pretense of depth. Pretense is useful because it allows people to talk more freely, believing themselves protected by ritual. The librarian was present, her posture upright, her gaze restless. Opposite her, the chaplain, his collar slightly loosened, as though even faith required a reprieve at table. The physician hovered nearby, making much of pouring for others, but never quite allowing his own glass to empty. The master, absent. His excuse was illness, but absence itself is often a statement. I thought so now. Conversation began with slightly academic schedules, minor scandals, the weather's inconsistency, but the undercurrent was darker, inevitable. The name Halliwell appeared sooner than I expected. The chaplain said the college had lost not only a man, but a fragment of its conscience. The librarian responded that conscience is often an invention of hindsight. There was a pause after that, the kind of pause that cannot be bridged with cheese. I asked quietly whether Halliwell had ever confided in them. The librarian's hand tightened briefly on the stem of her glass before she said that he had been a man who kept his counsel. The chaplain, however, spoke more freely. He said that Halliwell had once confessed not to a crime, not even to a sin, but to a temptation. He would not elaborate. The word temptation hung between us like incense. I asked what form it had taken. The chaplain said it was of the intellect, not the body. He added, almost apologetically, that temptation of the mind can be more dangerous than any other. Lewis shifted, uneasy with abstractions. He asked if they meant plagiarism. The librarian almost smiled, but not quite. She said that Halliwell's weakness was not theft, but pride, and pride never leaves paper evidence. I thought then of the photograph, the blurred face beside him, the will naming her alone. Pride, temptation, secrecy, a triad of shadows cast by a single figure. The wine deepened the evening. Words began to slip more easily from their keepers. The physician spoke at last, muttering that Halliwell had been reckless with his health, careless of warnings, arrogant in his disregard. He tapped his own chest as he said it, a gesture too emphatic to be casual. Lewis looked at me, waiting for me to interpret. I said nothing, though I noticed the physician's hand trembling slightly as he refilled his glass. Whether from wine or conscience, I could not be sure. Later, when the conversation broke into fragments, I found myself alone with the librarian near the shelves that lined the far wall. She asked me if I believed in the truth. I told her that belief was a word I used sparingly. She said that Halliwell had once promised her that the truth would outlive them both. Her eyes, level and unflinching, seemed to ask whether I thought he had kept that promise. I answered that promises, like photographs, fade at the edges. She looked away, but her hand lingered on the spine of a book, pressing too long, as though to steady herself. The title was Seneca. It was not accidental. When we left, Lewis remarked that nothing had been confessed except the obvious, that people disliked Halliwell and yet envied him all the same. I told him he was wrong. Confessions had been made, just not in words. He asked what I meant. I replied only that silence can confess as surely as speech. The night outside was raw, the rain needling against the cobblestones. I thought of the unfinished letter, the knot of twine, the missing lamp, the photograph's blurred face, each a kind of confession, each incomplete. I walked on with the taste of claret still on my tongue, and the certainty that the truth, whatever it was, would come, not with clarity, but with the slow darkening of the wine-glass, opaque, staining, and inescapable. The glass house returned to me, not in daylight, but in memory, as if its fractured pane had been waiting all along, for me to think of it again. It was Lewis who first suggested we revisit the place, his tone almost apologetic. He said the gardener had found something odd that morning and thought we might wish to see it. I told him that oddities were often more useful than certainties. He muttered something about riddles and set off ahead of me through the damp gardens. The glass house was colder than before, the heater silent, the orchids drooping as though in mourning. The gardener, cap in hand, pointed towards the far corner. There, where I had once traced the fracture with my fingertip, the pane was no longer whole. A shard had vanished, not shattered, not broken into scatterings across the floor, simply missing. A neat triangular absence, its edges too clean to be changed. I asked the gardener if he had swept it away. He shook his head firmly. Nothing to sweep. Gone. Lewis frowned at that, then glanced at me, as if waiting for me to confirm the improbability. I said only that glass does not walk by itself. I looked down at the soil beneath the gap, damp, disturbed, yet oddly without debris. Instead, there was a small impression, half a footprint, blurred at the edge where the earth had dried. A student's shoe, perhaps, or not. The size was indeterminate, but the angle told me the step had been taken from inside outward, not the reverse. The pressure pushed against the pane until it gave. Yet the shard had been removed deliberately afterwards. A gesture not of accident, but of concealment. Lewis asked what it meant. I told him it meant that absence was as eloquent as presence. He sighed, rubbed his forehead, and said he sometimes wished I spoke plain. I told him plain speech leaves too much unsaid. We left the gardener to his orchids and walked back through the misty lawns. Lewis asked again, more gently this time, whether I thought the shard was important. I said that the smallest fragments often cut deepest. He gave me that look of his, half exasperation, half trust, and said no more. Later that evening, I sat with the photograph once again, the one of Halliwell and the blurred woman beside him. My eye caught the lamplight glinting across its glossy surface, and I thought suddenly of reflections. A shard of glass, removed, held at an angle, might offer not only concealment, but vision. A mirror where one should not be. I traced the crease of the photograph with my thumb, and wondered whether Halliwell himself had once stared into that broken surface, seeing not himself, but the figure beside him. I took up a crossword, more from habit than hope, and found myself staring at a clue fragment missing from pane, 6 letters. The answer came too quickly, almost mockingly, splinter. I wrote it down, then erased it, then wrote it again. The word carried more weight than the clue deserved. I poured a whiskey and let the night settle. Outside, Oxford was quiet, its stone corridors glistening under rain that had just begun again. I thought of the missing shard, the footprint, the hand pressing too long on a spine of Seneca, the knot of twine, the unfinished sentence. Each detail was small, almost laughably so, yet together They formed the outline of something darker, though the shape was still concealed. I felt, not for the first time, that the truth was less a revelation than an accumulation of shards, gathered until the mirror was whole enough to wound. I drank slowly in silence. The shard was gone, but its absence pressed against me with the weight of glass. Oxford held its breath again, and I with it. The missing shard returned to me in thought long before it returned in fact. I lay awake that night, the rain brushing insistently against the window, and found myself tracing the geometry of its absence. A triangle of glass removed, edges neat, pressure from within. Lewis had dismissed it as vandalism, perhaps a student with too much wine and too little sense. Yet vandalism leaves evidence of shards scattered, boots crunching. Here there had been only removal. The difference between destruction and subtraction is small, but essential. The following morning I went alone, preferring not to answer Lewis's steady flow of questions before I had questions of my own. The gardens were pale with mist, the grass flattened by the night's rain. The glass house stood as it always had, innocent in its iron frame. Inside, the orchids looked worse than before, their petals browned, stems sagging. The heater had not been relit. I touched the fractured pane again, the edges cold beneath my fingers. It was then I noticed a faint trace on the metal frame itself, a smear, almost invisible, but visible enough if you wanted to see. A line of wax, candle wax, hardened into a pale streak. Why wax? I turned the thought over, a candle pressed against glass, its warmth softening the edges, weakening the bond between pane and frame. A trick, both careful and cruel. The shard had not been forced violently, but coaxed into release. Whoever had done it had taken time. Patience is a rarer commodity than strength. Lewis found me later, notebook in hand, and asked what I was doing, crouched in the damp. I told him I was looking for light in the wrong place. He frowned. Unused to metaphors at breakfast, I pointed out the wax. He knelt, squinting, then asked if I was sure. I said certainty was a luxury, but suspicion often enough. He muttered that I enjoyed making things complicated. I said the world had already done that for me. We walked back toward the lodge. The quadrangle was quiet. Students moving in pairs beneath umbrellas, voices carrying just enough to remind us of life continuing. Lewis asked whether the shard itself mattered. I told him that what is removed is often more telling than what remains. He nodded reluctantly, though his eyes betrayed doubt. I did not blame him. Doubt is the companion of all honest men. That evening I sat in the library again, the east window dripping with rain. The librarian was at her desk, head bent over a ledger, her pen moving in neat, mechanical strokes. I asked her, almost casually, whether she remembered the glass house in its better days. She said she preferred not to visit it now the damp was unkind to her lungs. Her eyes, however, lifted briefly when she spoke, and I caught the faintest flicker of something fear, memory, perhaps recognition. It was gone almost at once, but it lingered in me. Back in my room I turned to the crossword once more. The clue read, method, behind breakage, 5 letters. I stared at it longer than necessary, until the answer arranged itself with quiet inevitability, logic. I penciled it in, hesitated, then pressed harder, as though affirmation could come from the weight of the pencil itself. The logic of shattered glass was not violence, but design, not accident, but intention. I poured a whiskey, the glass cool in my hand. The city outside was heavy with drizzle, the lamps reflected in slick stone. I thought of Halliwell's letter, the will, naming the librarian, the photograph blurred at its edges, the knot of twine, the unfinished sentence. Each detail was small, yet together they seemed to gather like fragments of glass in a paper bag, rattling softly, waiting to cut. And I wondered if the missing shard was hidden in some drawer, or had it already been put to use? Mirrors and windows are alike in one respect. Both reveal, both conceal, both can be broken. I finished the whiskey and set the glass down too hard on the table, the sound sharper than intended. For a moment I imagined it fracturing, splintering into pieces that could never be rejoined. But it held. Only Oxford, and I with it, seemed ready to break. It was not a resolution I found at the end of the case, but a hush that seemed heavier than words. Oxford has a way of absorbing tragedies into its stone, leaving no trace but the faintest echo, and I have always suspected that those echoes are louder for some of us than for others. I walked through the quadrangle late that night, the rain holding back for once, the cobbles dark with memory rather than water. The lanterns burned dimly, as though reluctant to disturb the silence. Lewis had left earlier, muttering that the paperwork would be enough to occupy him until dawn. I envied him for an occupation tangible, free from speculation. For me, the puzzle never concludes. Even when the pieces fit, I see the gaps between them, and it is those gaps that trouble me most. In my flat, I poured a final measure and set the crossword before me, a habit, a comfort, a torment. The clue that caught my eye read, "End piece, 4 letters, coda." I filled it in without hesitation, yet as I wrote it, I felt a pang that the word was too neat, too final for the mess of human lives. Halliwell's death had left no coda, only an unresolved cadence. Still, the crossword offered me the illusion of closure, and illusions are sometimes kinder than truth. I thought again of the librarian, her fingers tapping out rhythms she claimed not to hear. I thought of the chaplain, speaking of temptation as if he knew it intimately. I thought of the photograph, blurred at its edges, and the shard of glass missing from the pane. Each detail flickered in me like embers refusing to die. I could not say with certainty who had lied, nor whether Halliwell's death had been entirely his own. What I could say was that the shadows around him had deepened rather than lifted. That, I suppose, is a kind of answer, though not one a court would accept. The whiskey was slow, deliberate, the kind of drink meant not for company but for solitude. I let it linger, listening to the muted hum of the city beyond my window, the occasional car, a distant laugh, the whisper of wind shifting against stone. Oxford never sleeps entirely. It dreams instead, and its dreams are filled with footsteps in corridors, with whispers in chapels, with pages turning in empty libraries. I do not know why I remembered, at that moment, the scarf I had seen discarded on the grass in the first days of the investigation. A triviality, perhaps. Yet I thought again of how its colours had dulled in the rain, how it had lain there unnoticed by all but me. An object forgotten, like the knot of twine, like the smear of wax, like the unfinished sentence. The scarf had never been claimed, and I realized with a quiet ache that it never would be. Not all puzzles are resolved. Some remain forever folded, their answers lost in the margins. Lewis would later say we had done enough, that justice, in whatever form it could take, had been served. I did not argue, yet I could not silence the thought that justice is often an illusion crafted to let us sleep more easily. And sleep for me has never come without a struggle. I closed the crossword, finished the whiskey, and sat in the quiet. No revelation, no triumph, no neat conclusion. Only the awareness that a life had ended and that others would carry on, each with their own silences, their own secrets. A coda, perhaps, but played in a minor key, fading into nothing before the final note could sound. And so I leave the case therein complete, unresolved, unfinished. Like Oxford itself, like myself,